Think the Great Wall of China was an impenetrable fortress that kept invaders out for centuries. You've been lied to. This massive engineering marvel, one of the most impressive construction projects in human history, was actually a colossal military disaster that failed spectacularly when it mattered most. We're talking about a structure that stretches over 13,000 miles, took over 2,000 years to build, and cost millions of lives. Yet when push came to shove, it couldn't stop a single determined invasion. Not one. But here's what'll blow your mind. The wall's most catastrophic failures didn't come from enemy siege engines or superior tactics. They came from something far more brutal: betrayal from within. Chinese generals literally opened the gates and invited their enemies inside. The Great Wall we see today is mostly the Ming Dynasty version, built between 1368 and 1644. This wasn't just any construction project. It was a military investment so massive it would be like the United States spending its entire GDP for the next 50 years on a single defense system. The human cost was staggering. Over 1 million workers died building just the Ming sections. Chinese folklore says there's a body buried under every stone, and archaeological evidence suggests that's not much of an exaggeration. The wall was designed to do three things: slow down raiders, create a communication network, and control trade. On paper, it was brilliant. In reality, it became the world's most expensive monument to strategic failure. But here's the thing that makes this story so brutal. The wall didn't fail because of engineering flaws or superior enemy technology. It failed because of human nature, corruption, and the simple fact that the strongest fortress in the world is useless if your own people turn against you. First, let's destroy the biggest myth about the Great Wall, that it was built to completely stop invasions. That's Hollywood nonsense. The wall was actually designed as a management system, not an impenetrable barrier. Think of it like a medieval traffic control system. It would force raiders to attack at specific fortified points instead of sweeping across the border wherever they wanted. Signal towers would send messages faster than any horseman could ride, giving Chinese armies time to respond. The problem: this worked perfectly against cattle rustlers and small raiding parties, but was absolutely useless against organized armies. It's like building a fence to keep out burglars, only to discover that the mafia can just blow holes in it whenever they want. Here's the brutal math. The Ming Wall stretched over 5,500 miles. Even if you stationed 100 soldiers at every mile, requiring over 500,000 troops, you still couldn't defend against a concentrated attack. But here's where it gets even worse. The wall's designers made a fundamental error that would doom millions of people to death and conquest. The Great Wall's architects built a static defense against a dynamic threat. They created the world's longest sitting duck. Every military strategist since Sun Tzu has warned against relying solely on fortifications, and the Great Wall proves why. Static defenses only work if the enemy plays by your rules. The moment someone gets creative, and trust me, desperate enemies get very creative, your wall becomes irrelevant. Archaeological evidence shows the wall had thousands of gates, watchtowers, and garrison points. But maintaining a 5,500-mile fortification is like trying to keep a small city running, except this city is stretched across an entire continent. The logistics alone were a nightmare. Getting food, weapons, and supplies to remote sections required a supply chain that would make Amazon jealous. And just like any massive bureaucracy, it was riddled with corruption from day one. Here's where the human drama begins, and it's uglier than you can imagine. The biggest enemy of the Great Wall wasn't Mongol cavalry or siege engines. It was corruption and neglect. The very people trusted to maintain China's greatest defense were systematically destroying it from the inside. Funds allocated for wall maintenance constantly disappeared into private pockets. Money meant for repairs would vanish, leaving entire sections to crumble. Archaeological surveys have found sections where the wall was literally falling apart while it was still being built. But the garrison system was even worse. To cut costs, the government turned elite warrior units into farming communities. These guys were supposed to be China's border guards, but instead they were growing vegetables and raising chickens. One Ming Dynasty record describes a garrison where soldiers hadn't received proper military training in over a decade. When Mongol raiders attacked, these defenders literally ran away and hid in their vegetable gardens. The raiders walked through unopened gates. Here's the most brutal part. The wall's design made corruption inevitable. With thousands of isolated posts spread across impossible terrain, there was no way to monitor what was happening. It was like trying to run a business with 10,000 branch offices and no communication system. But the most catastrophic failure was yet to come, and it would prove that no wall can defend against human treachery. When Genghis Khan decided to conquer China in the 13th century, he faced walls that had been strengthened and improved for centuries. The Jin dynasty controlled northern China and had extensive fortification systems that should have been impregnable. But Khan didn't waste time trying to break down walls. He understood something the Chinese engineers had missed. The strongest fortress is worthless if you can convince the guards to open the gates. Here's where the story gets really dark. When the Jin dynasty moved their capital south, they essentially abandoned their northern defenses. Suddenly, you had undermanned, demoralized garrisons facing the most effective military machine in medieval history. But Khan's masterstroke wasn't military, it was psychological warfare. The garrisons were manned partly by ethnic Khitan soldiers who were oppressed by the Jin dynasty. Khan's agents didn't attack these troops. They convinced them to switch sides. The result was a betrayal so complete, it's almost unbelievable. The Mongols didn't break through the Great Wall. Chinese soldiers opened the gates and invited them in. The wall that was supposed to protect China became the highway the Mongols used to conquer it. The human cost was unimaginable. Millions died in the wars that followed. Entire cities were erased from existence. An entire civilization was brought to its knees because the world's most expensive defense system was defeated by a handful of traitors. But if you think that's the worst failure in the Great Wall's history, you're wrong. The most brutal collapse was still to come. If you want to see the Great Wall's most spectacular failure, look at how the Ming dynasty fell in 1644. This is a masterclass in how the world's most impressive fortification became completely irrelevant in the face of human weakness. The Manchus had been trying to breach the wall for decades and kept failing. The fortifications were strong, the garrisons well supplied. But then China started tearing itself apart from the inside, and no wall could defend against that. A rebel army led by Li Zicheng captured Beijing and toppled the Ming government. The last Ming general, Wu Sangui, found himself trapped at the Shanhai Pass, the most strategically important gate in the entire wall system. He had rebels to the south demanding his surrender and Manchus to the north who had been his enemies for decades. Here's where the story becomes almost unbelievable. Wu Sangui, faced with an impossible choice, made a decision that changed the course of history. He opened the gates of the Great Wall and allied with the Manchus, China's greatest enemies, to fight the rebels. The Manchus, who had been unable to break through the wall for decades, simply walked through the front door because a Chinese general invited them in. They helped Wu Sangui defeat the rebels, then turned on him and conquered all of China. The Great Wall, built with the blood of millions, maintained at crushing cost for centuries, was defeated not by superior military technology or brilliant strategy, but by one man's moment of desperation. The Manchus established the Qing dynasty and ruled China for over 250 years. The wall had become worse than useless. It had become the instrument of China's own destruction. Let's talk numbers, because the scale of this disaster is almost incomprehensible. The Great Wall cost the equivalent of $360 billion in today's money, more than the entire GDP of most countries. The human cost was even more staggering. Over 1 million people died building just the Ming Dynasty sections. Entire generations of Chinese families were wiped out in the construction process. But here's the really brutal part. All that money and all those lives bought China exactly 0 successful defenses against major invasions. Every single time a determined enemy wanted to conquer Chinese territory, they found a way through, around, or over the wall. The wall worked against small raiding parties, basically medieval criminals. But against organized military campaigns, it had a 100% failure rate. That's not just ineffective, that's catastrophically useless. Modern military analysts study the Great Wall as a textbook example of what happens when you build static defenses against dynamic threats. It's the most expensive military failure in human history. The fundamental problem with the Great Wall was that it was designed to stop a symptom, not the disease. Chinese leaders thought their problem was nomadic raids, so they built a wall to keep raiders out. But the real problem was geopolitical instability, internal corruption, and human nature itself. Here's the brutal truth about static defenses. They only work if the enemy plays by your rules. The moment someone decides to get creative, bribing guards, exploiting political divisions, or just waiting for internal collapse, your wall becomes a monument to strategic stupidity. The Great Wall had 3 fatal flaws that no amount of engineering could fix. First, it required perfect human performance across thousands of miles and hundreds of years. Humans are corruptible, lazy, and prone to making catastrophic mistakes. Building a defense system that depends on perfect human behavior is like building a dam out of tissue paper. Second, it was purely defensive. The wall couldn't attack, couldn't pursue enemies, and couldn't adapt to changing threats. It was a static solution to a dynamic problem. Third, and most importantly, it couldn't defend against internal threats. Every major breach of the Great Wall happened because someone on the inside opened the gates. You can build the strongest wall in the world, but if your own people turn against you, that wall becomes your prison, not your protection. The Great Wall's failure teaches us something crucial that applies just as much today as it did 500 years ago. No physical barrier can compensate for internal weakness and corruption. The wall failed because the Chinese government that built it was rotting from the inside. Corrupt officials embezzled funds. Commanders sold supplies on the black market. Soldiers became farmers instead of warriors. When the moment of truth came, the wall was just an expensive pile of stones, defended by people who had lost the will to fight. This pattern repeats throughout history. The Maginot Line failed in World War II for similar reasons. The Berlin Wall fell not because of military assault, but because the system it protected collapsed from within. Modern cybersecurity experts study the Great Wall as an example of why perimeter defense alone is insufficient. You can build the strongest firewall in the world, but if your employees are selling passwords to hackers, your security is worthless. The brutal lesson is that true security comes from internal strength, not external barriers. A corrupt, divided society cannot be protected by walls, no matter how impressive those walls might be. Today, the Great Wall stands as one of humanity's most impressive engineering achievements, and that's exactly what makes its military failure so instructive. This wasn't primitive technology or poor planning. It was a masterpiece of construction that failed because its builders misunderstood the nature of war itself. They thought they were fighting raiders and nomads, so they built a wall to keep them out. But they were actually fighting human nature, political corruption, and the inevitable decay that comes when a civilization loses its internal cohesion. The Great Wall's legacy isn't its stones and mortar. It's the lesson that static defenses are only as strong as the society that maintains them. When that society rots from within, even the most impressive fortifications become monuments to strategic failure. Every stone in that wall represents not just the death of a worker, but the death of a strategic concept that was doomed from the moment construction began. If you thought the Great Wall's failure was shocking, wait until you see what happened when medieval engineers built siege weapons so powerful they made walls completely obsolete. Click here to discover the mechanical monsters that could breach any fortification in days, and why even the strongest castles in history became death traps for their own defenders when faced with the right technology.